we need to begin by finding where kindness has been compromised in a person's past. That's what trauma is. And then see if we can liberate these protective mechanisms so that people can come out going, wow, I actually can be open to receiving kindness now. I don't have to be protecting myself. And I can also then be a source of kindness for others.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Kindness in Action podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Gruber. Today's episode is incredibly special. I'm honored and honestly still a little in awe to welcome Dr. Dan Siegel as our very first guest. Dan is the founder and director of education at the Mindsight Institute and the co-founding director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center at UCLA, which is where I first connected with him during my mindfulness teacher training. He's also the founding editor of the Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology and has overseen the publication of more than 100 textbooks exploring the mind and mental health through this interdisciplinary lens. He's a graduate of Harvard Medical School and completed his postgraduate training at UCLA in pediatrics and psychiatry. His research training through the National Institute of Mental Health focused on how relationships shape our autobiographical understanding of our lives and our development across the lifespan. Dan is an award-winning educator and the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers. His work has been translated into over 40 languages and spans parenting, clinical practice, meditation, and the field he created, interpersonal neurobiology. You might recognize some of his titles like The Whole Brain Child, Aware, and The Developing Mind. Dan's work has deeply shaped how we understand the brain, relationships, trauma, and healing. And for me personally, his work became the missing link in the development of my own work. I still remember being on Zoom during my training when Dan spoke to our cohort. At that time, I was in the early stages of drafting my dissertation proposal. I was working with a high-need parent population and trying to make the case, drawing from attachment theory, that helping parents strengthen their emotion regulation could support their children's emotion regulation too. I believed mindfulness might be a practical way to do this, but I hadn't quite found the thread to tie it all together. Then Dan said something I'll never forget, that secure attachment and mindfulness both shape the brain in similar ways. Both promote integration, which, as we'll explore in this episode, is a state of health and optimal functioning. That was the aha moment I needed. It brought together everything I was trying to articulate. Dan later agreed to serve on my dissertation committee, and I learned so much from him in that process. This conversation on kindness, integration, and healing from trauma is in many ways a continuation of that work in the same community where it all began. And in this latest round of work, I've had another aha moment, realizing that kindness itself, through its promotion of integration, has the power to heal trauma. Whether you're brand new to Dan's work or a longtime reader, I think you'll find something grounding, inspiring, and truly hopeful here. Let's begin. Welcome, Dan. I am so happy to be with you. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.
Great to see you.
Yes. Well, and so I want to talk to you today about sort of part 2 of the dissertation work in the school district. And so I returned to the same district where I did my dissertation research and taught the parents basic mindful awareness with the intention to promote integration within themselves and within their relationships to help foster integration within their children, and decided to add another layer, which was practicing kindness using mindfulness within the family. And I thought that what would happen was that more harmony would be fostered, greater cooperation within the family. And certainly that did happen, but something else happened that was quite unexpected for me, which was that participants seemed to really connect with their hearts through this kindness practice. And what was there in their hearts and waiting for them was old wounds that needed to be healed and addressed. And we both know that within this community, there is a high degree of trauma exposure. This is a disenfranchised community. And so what surprised me is that a lot of those old wounds that were ready to be healed there were really unresolved trauma or unresolved grief. And what I found so amazing is that through this 8-week class, which was sponsored by a Mind and Life Institute grant, that kindness has the ability to help heal trauma. And
Hmm.
I also learned a lot just from watching participants go through this 8-week class of the sort of blossoming process, the healing process that happens when people move through these unresolved trauma states and into something else, into the future. And so I was very excited about this, and I really want to talk to you about that. And I thought perhaps we could start with, from your perspective, the relationship between trauma, integration, and kindness.
Yeah. Well, first of all, what fantastic work, Natalie. Thank you for having the vision to do it and the discipline to carry it out and the really devotion to really trying to bring well-being into the world. So thank you and bravo. That's fantastic. Yeah, it's a really powerful, I think, insight that you're offering to us that when people go under the surface of where they may be, there can be some leftover issues that can affect them and affect certainly the way they relate inside to their inner lives and then how they relate to other people. And, kindness is a fascinating human capacity. Of course, it's defined in different ways. Some people say it's doing something for another human being where you're not asking for anything in return. Some people define it as honoring one another's vulnerability. It's really, in many ways, the fundamental stance you take about positive regard, having a positive stance towards the well-being of others. So it's in different contemplative traditions. People talk about it in different ways, loving kindness, caring, this nurturing ability that we have. So kindness, for me, from a deep scientific point of view, is really the external expression of this process you've mentioned called integration, which is where different aspects of a person or different aspects of a system can be honored for their differences and then linkages promoted. And so when you think about a kind act or you think about receiving someone's kindness, you are being seen for the individual that you are without having to become the other person. So that's the differentiation. But there's a deep linkage filled with compassion. So in many ways, kindness and compassion kind of go together, and their integration made visible is what we say at our institute. And I think that's what you're revealing. And in trauma, sometimes acts of not kindness that we call trauma can lodge in us, and then we develop all sorts of protective mechanisms. And sometimes they're very active, so we don't feel our feelings. Sometimes they're more kind of built into us, so we may have some literally structural compromises in how our brain developed that make it harder to regulate our emotions or even to regulate how we behave or interact with other people. So, I have this cup called Securely Attached, but it's that attachment of security that gives us a feeling like things are going to be okay. Like I can expect kindness from others. So I think the journey that you've done in schools is to say, we need to begin by finding where kindness has been compromised in a person's past.
Mhm.
That's what trauma is. And then see if we can liberate these protective mechanisms so that people can come out going, wow, I actually can be open to receiving kindness now. I don't have to be protecting myself. And I can also then be a source of kindness for others.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think one thing that you're talking about is these defense mechanisms and ways of sort of protecting oneself in the world that may or may not be conscious. And I really observed within the participants that some were sort of in a state of rigidity, like maybe the range of their emotions that they could express were somewhat limited, or also talk about these states of chaos that they would go into, feeling really anxious and overwhelmed. So certainly I saw some of that, and also the bringing kindness into the kind practice involves setting an intention for kindness and then going inward to reflect, how am I feeling right now? And where do I feel that in my body? And then bringing kindness to whatever it is that is arising. So if it's something that's negative, you're neutralizing it with your kindness, maybe saying some phrases, what you really need to hear right now, or you're really affirming and nurturing yourself with kindness if it's more positive or neutral.
Yeah.
And then D, directing it outwards, can be towards family members. And when we started directing kindness towards family members, this is when that opposite of kindness started to arise, right? What if you start directing it towards somebody who's been very difficult towards you, then the opposite might arise. But you're always offering kindness to yourself first. So I felt that this was a really important sort of systematic way of healing. I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, it's two things come up from, what you're exploring. I mean, one is, when someone does get the invitation to go inward and say, look, can you be kind to these family members? And some of them were unkind. It really raises two big issues. One is, how has this person made sense of how those past, adversities have impacted them? And if they're still holding on to an adversity without, what people like Fred Luskin would write about forgiveness, where the word forgiveness is sometimes felt to be, I can't forgive someone for these terrible things they did to me because then I'm saying it was okay what happened. So when people interpret that process of forgiveness that way, they then remain imprisoned by the trauma because they are holding on to the negativity. Another way of thinking about forgiveness is actually you forgive others for your own benefit,
Right.
because then you're saying, I can, number one, acknowledge what happened to me. And ideally, that person who did something negative to me will apologize. But my well-being is not going to be dependent on their having the courage and integrity to apologize for something they did that was bad. Instead, I can be empowered to actually forgive, where one way of defining forgiveness that my dear colleague and friend Jack Kornfield often says it this way, it's forgiveness is giving up all hope for a different and better past. And when you give up all hope for a different and better past, it frees you because you say, I accept, deep acceptance that what happened happened. I accept there was a time I was very vulnerable as a young person, and this person in a position of authority hurt me. And I accept those things. I'm not trying to hide from them. So I forgive that person in the sense that I'm giving up all hope that I'm going to pretend the negative things that actually happened didn't happen. I'm not going to pretend I can change the past, but I'm empowered because now I can make sense of how those things that now I can see and accept affected me and liberate myself, and I'm no longer in prison. If you don't go through the pathway of forgiveness, you're just locked into the prison of the past. Even though you think it's defending you because you're furious with what happened, that makes sense. But then the fury eats at your soul. And that's, I think, what we can see, and it affects other relationships. So that's where really the empowerment comes, is through the journey of forgiveness.
Yes. And we found that to be so important too through this process of sort of allowing emotions that arose to be the guide, and things like backdraft, that old unnameable pain arising, and being able to name that. And then forgiveness being, I sort of framed it as a practice, just like kindness is a practice where it comes from within us. So we're just like what you're saying, you're resolving something within yourself, not necessarily saying that it was okay for an authority figure to harm the child or something like that, but you're resolving those feelings within yourself and then feeling more empowered. So there was one parent who talked about, and I had known her previously from the dissertation study, and I never knew this about her. She brought up past history around neglect and how both parents really hadn't been present for her in her joys and her sorrows, and how essentially going through the class and moving through this process gave her both the strength and the self-confidence to hold a conversation with one of her parents and let them know how that felt to her, what that was like for her. But she really described it as holding a kind container for the conversation, because otherwise this person really wasn't receptive to hearing anything like that. And
Mm.
two amazing things happened. One was that he apologized to her for the first time in her whole life and acknowledged her feelings. And then he also provided some more context about what was happening in the family that sort of had pulled his attention and energy away. And this, because she was a child when this was happening, she didn't really have that understanding or context. And so she came away from that conversation feeling a lot more resolved and satisfied in her relationship with her parent and having this larger understanding of what had happened to her. And so, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think, the phrase making sense, I think this example you're giving is really beautifully illustrating it. It's both making logical sense, like what happened, but it's also sensing it in your body. So
Yeah.
making sense isn't just the logical part. It includes, if you will, both sides of your brain. It includes your head and your heart and your gut, and includes your whole being. That's the making sense process. And there's something, it's interesting, and this is a whole long line of both scientific reasoning and indigenous teachings and contemplative teachings. But there's reason to believe that in pure awareness, it's filled with actually love. And, sometimes people shy away from that word love because maybe they interpret it as romantic love or sexual love or something, and they don't want to use it. And I was talking with this wonderful friend and colleague, Paul Gilbert, who studies compassion in England. And we were talking about these words, and he said a word he finds very useful, which we can throw into our discussion, Natalie, is benevolence, is the wishing well in the world, wishing well for other beings, human beings, all of nature, wishing well for your internal sense of who you are, because we're more than just our individual lives. And this benevolence is kind of the warmth of kindness, I think, that there is this feeling of positivity. And for me, the benevolence is really what arises from this open awareness. Ram Dass used to, when he was alive, would use the term loving awareness, and Jack Kornfield and Trudy Goodman use that term loving awareness. And the idea from this practice that we do called the wheel of awareness, done with lots and lots of people, is when people get into the hub of this wheel, which is the knowing of consciousness as separated from the knowns that are represented in the metaphoric rim, they start experiencing this feeling of connection, this open awareness, this love. You can remember that with the acronym COAL: connection, open awareness, and love. Another way of using it is curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love. But the idea of that curiosity is you come with this incredible gratitude for being alive, this kind of fascination with being here, that we're all in existence, and benevolence can rise up from that. If you've been traumatized, those protective layers will come in and start kind of snuffing out what can feel like a real tender vulnerability when you realize we're all connected. And you realize that you are filled with love, and as one parliamentarian, when I was teaching the Wheel of Awareness in another country, said, "Oh, if I mention the word love, people will think I'm weak," when in fact, our governments should be creating their policies based on love and kindness
Absolutely.
and benevolence, right? Instead of what we see all over the world, And so when we feed people who are hungry, when we protect people who are in danger, and not just people, but when we see that we're all a part of the entirety of nature, and we see trees and other plants and organisms as who we are, then benevolence is kind of the way of doing that. There's a whole line of studies you probably know about, for example, how trees communicate with each other, how the fungi communicate, and there's a kind of mutual benevolence that arises in those kinds of systems that we humans, having brains that have unfortunately, the vulnerability to think we're separate
Mhm.
and come up with this, what Einstein called optical delusion, a psychotic belief that we're separate. That sad vulnerability of the human brain has made us incredibly destructive with people we say are not like us or don't have our beliefs or different nationalities or whatever. And you see all the destruction in the world or the destruction of humans to the natural world. So it's a real vulnerability, and we see it in families, when kids are abused, and so all these are like the opposite of benevolence and the opposite of kindness. And so trying to find a way toward that, like you're doing in your project, to release people from these protective layers that have been activated in response to them not being treated with benevolence. So I don't know how that word that Paul Gilbert suggested to me we consider using feels to you, but to me, it has this incredible gentleness to it and yet strength at the same time. But how does it sit with you, Natalie?
It feels to my body, it feels nurturing. It feels good to even hear the word benevolence. This, yeah, kindness, gentleness, strength, a genuine care. And I was really struck by how people who participate in this program really, it was like once they sort of moved through, when we identified the backdraft and moved through forgiveness and kind of out the other side, that this authenticity, strength, confidence, kind of like a most healed version of oneself seemed to emerge, and one that was really committed to kindness and sharing it with strangers, making new relationships, diffusing conflicts, doing all these benevolent types of behaviors because they felt so good. And we talked about that throughout the class, that whatever we do to someone else, we really do it to ourselves first. So if we're kind to someone, we experience that within our nervous system, within our own body first, right? And so we benefit.
Yeah,
And so it
yeah,
really
exactly.
becomes so rewarding.
Totally. Yeah. And, integration comes from that space that you're creating in that class, and then it kind of naturally flourishes. So it's almost like you found the key to liberating the kindness and benevolence that can then generate its own reinforcing, mutuality, which is a beautiful thing. Really, really beautiful.
It was so beautiful. And it wasn't clear to me, even at first, that kindness was kind of like this change mechanism being practiced this way, until I was
Yeah.
following up and hearing about you think about Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build theory, how
Yeah.
people just take off, right? And these benefits start building upon themselves. Like,
Right. Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. And, unfortunately, in our world, we sometimes get bombarded in social media or in reading the news, with people who are the opposite of that. And it has a harsh and, not kind and not empathic, not showing no compassion. And they take front and center in news stories. And so we can get preoccupied with that. But the real strength is not in this blustering, violent, destructive way of being, even though that catches our ear and our eye in the news. It's actually the strength of connection and the strength of love and the strength of the kindness that you're exploring. All those are, expressions of benevolence to come from deep inside and feel the positive regard and the positive intention for the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really, as you're saying, what the world needs now is to be reminded of our inner strength and power that can come from
Yeah.
kindness, and the power of our connections and being in
Yeah.
kind connection with others, not trying to assert dominance over them or take away things that are fundamental to their well-being.
Right. Exactly. Well, some people, say that's power with rather than power over. And I just finished writing a foreword for a book that I think the name is Inner Strength or Quiet Strength, something like that. But it's by Margaret Cullen, and it's all about equanimity.
Mm.
And in writing the foreword, it reminds me of what we're talking about here, which is, that equanimity is, one of these processes. It was in the Stoic tradition in Greek philosophy, thousands of years ago. It is in the Buddhist tradition from thousands of years ago too, as one of what's called four immeasurables. which I think
Mhm.
include, if I remember correctly, loving kindness, joy, compassion, equanimity. And equanimity in a way is foundational to everything we're talking about. So that if someone is, and how do we define equanimity? It's this kind of spacious, receptive awareness that is open to whatever arises and can feel feelings fully and differentiate them from each other and be present for painful memories of things that were really hard in the past. And yet you have this kind of sense of benevolence and love and spaciousness, even as you're very aware of these things. So some people will say, oh, it's a kind of dissociation and you're becoming disconnected from experience. And there are risks of that in certain practices for sure, that people just numb out, right? And they actually feel disconnected to what's actually going on. But in equanimity, it's the opposite of that. It's really this ability to have that spacious hub of the wheel is what I think it is. And in that hub is the reality of our deep interconnectedness. And in that hub is what you, in the wheel of awareness practice, that hub,
Mhm.
you're really getting access to what, in things I've written about, I think is like a plane of possibility. And in that plane is where hope arises because it's where all these potentials are sitting before they turn into actualities. And that's a whole book to just explain all that. But just to say that when people gather this kindness you're talking about, it's also filled with hope. And that's why kindness in this moment in human evolution is so crucial. The equanimity that allows kindness to flourish also comes with a hope that isn't just a false hope. It's like what Joanna Macy used to write about and talk about, active hope. It's a realistic place of equanimity that gives you access to these other options you didn't even know were there. It's a source you can turn to again and again. And that's why kindness, I think, is so powerful because it is tapped into this plane of possibility.
Mhm.
It is the source of love and benevolence where that arises from. And if you can do a practice like the wheel of awareness or
Mhm.
the things you're doing with the class that allow people to get beneath those protective layers, it's fantastic, you know?
It really is. It's the power of mindful awareness of awareness, right, in the hub. And
Hmm.
also the equanimity, being able to hold things exactly as they are, having sort of like a spacious container, right? And then I think too, in times when we're really encountering difficulties in particular, cultivating these positive qualities, not in an unrealistic way, but bringing in the ability to hold it with kindness, or you're activating oxytocin, right? When you're engaging in kindness. And so it's sort of, calling on our capacity for love, even in the midst of difficulty,
Yeah.
which I think can be
Yeah,
so
exactly.
healing, which
Mhm.
really
Yeah.
was so healing. And this idea around, or the plane of possibility, really to me does feel like you're tapping into the universes, and I think that's what you're describing, right? The universal potential.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. The more I think we can become familiar with and at ease with talking about that, and I know it can take us off on a tangent, but just to say that when you do a kind of a deep scientific kind of overview and compare some of these cross scientific perspectives in something called consilience, where you find a common ground across independent findings, you do find indigenous teachings from thousands of years ago independently come to similar conclusions. Contemplative practices, meditative practices have come to similar conclusions. And what the view is for our modern times is that we now have a scientific support for the notion that you have a kind of what Isaac Newton found out, a certain realm, which is time dependent. Things like seem like they are noun like entities, like your body's there, my body's here. We're separated in time and space. So those are real from a Newtonian point of view. Anything larger than an atom has these properties that Newton described 350 years ago. But then you find out that in the last 100 years, there's another realm, kind of like if the Newtonian realm is equivalent to walking on the land, you also have the experience of walking around a lake, and you can jump in the lake, and the properties of swimming in the water are just different from walking on the land around the shore. So we also have a realm that has no nouns, just verb-like processes. It has no separation across what in Newtonian terms we've called space and we've called time. And so then when people tap into the benevolence of the plane of possibility, it feels timeless because it is. And it's almost like love is the fabric of the universe when you mention universal, and that when people can have the courage to tap into this place, which is so different because it's filled with uncertainty and it doesn't have the, illusion of, concrete identity, like I'm this noun, you're that noun. And you realize, wow, we're all interconnected in these processes that we really can't control totally. Then, like me on this walking desk, then you start walking through these incredibly exciting ways where you start seeing stuff arise. And that's what happens when you let go of these protective shields, when the child just has to try to get something that's certain in the face of especially attachment figures who may be causing them terror. And so they withdraw, understandably. But then that sadly keeps them from accessing the plane of possibility because that's where maximal uncertainty is. So it's scary initially. But then when they can come to feel the love that's there and the possibility that's there, they come to realize that what before they feared, they now can embrace because they realize the synonym for uncertainty is freedom and possibility. And then you may be seeing this in your groups. Kindness starts to arise without them trying to make it happen. It's just the natural way to have this mutual, benevolence.
Yeah, that is so beautiful. And it reminds me of how this concept of time, forgiveness can be historical and about sort of healing the energetic past, like the emotions of the past. And then I did a lot with the participants around also envisioning a future self, a kindest version of themselves. And one of them described it as sort of meeting the strongest version of themselves with maybe their most vulnerable self. So all of those layers of defense kind of meeting maybe their most spacious, least connected to the noun-like version of them. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
just the possibilities that came through for them and the
Right.
possibilities that then emerged within their lives. Many of them had these physical transformations and started just looking healthier. Hair grew back. People started
Wow.
wearing jewelry again and thinking about their jobs and their education and neighborhoods and maybe and their relationships. Does this suit me or not anymore? Right. And so kind of
Totally.
expanding more around these possibilities for what could be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that's so beautiful. It's great because that freedom you give people is a gift that will just keep on giving inside of themselves and to the people who will become a part of their lives. And that it's just fantastic, Natalie. And I just so respect what you're doing and want to really acknowledge what a vision you had for trying to make this work, and then seeing how to combine, your wonderful presence with these folks who are so privileged to have you as part of their journey, but also to do the rigorous stuff of saying, is there a scientific underlay to this? And, interpersonal neurobiology, is trying to provide some of those insights for exactly what you're doing. I mean, that's fantastic.
Thank you for your support. I'm so grateful. I've learned so much from you. And
Well, I've learned so much from you.
well, that's amazingly kind of you to say it to me, Dan. Before we go, could we do
Yes,
one thing? Can I
of course.
share with you? I did interviews to sort of capture and observations to capture the changes in the participants. This was sponsored by Mind and Life. And so there's research connected to this project that I've been sharing with you today. And I was so taken with what participants said about what kindness feels like to them that I actually got very curious about what would happen when I my children, what kindness felt like to them. Can I share this with you?
Please do. Please do.
Your response. Okay.
Oh, that is so precious, so beautiful, and so insightful. What wisdom.
I was like,
Oh my
yeah, I
God.
gotta grab my recording device. But I think that what it really underscores is that, so I have a vision, Dan, that kindness can be taught in the family. And of course, I was delighted to hear my children say that kindness begins in the family and just what this could foster in terms of more strength and resilience within families and within communities as families connect
Yeah.
with each other. So,
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think one thing as you go on the journey on how to articulate that is somehow, yes, kindness is teachable and your kids have beautifully expressed it, that you two have taught them that. That's fantastic. Then we want to look at the flip side and say, well, if you were raised in a family where you didn't have that happening with your parents and you didn't learn it, in quotes, is there hope for you? And the answer is a resounding yes.
absolutely.
So,
Yes.
yeah. So that's the always want as educators, we always want to say, yes,
Hmm.
let's make sure kids get it if they can. But if you don't, you can always learn it. And one way to say it that way is that kindness is the natural state that no matter what has happened to a person, it can't be obliterated. So that we want to release this natural state. Why? Because I think it comes from the plane of possibility, which is something that is inside of everyone. And they may have developed all sorts of protective layers to keep them from that uncertainty of that origin of our consciousness, of our being aware. So, I think that's, first of all, the truth from indigenous contemplative and scientific studies. And I think it's the truth. And it's a message that people aren't aware of usually. So if they hear, oh yeah, kindness is taught. Oh, then they go, yeah, but I wasn't taught it. So I'm hopeless. We have to really make sure we speak directly to those folks who've been through a lot of adversity, who may fear that, God, I didn't have that opportunity when I was a kid. It's over, it's not over. And so that's the good message, and that's why, like, whenever I teach about what you've explored, for example, in terms of people uncovering trauma and people hearing about, the adverse childhood experiences
Right.
study and all that stuff, I said, keep in mind that when you make sense of trauma, the very mechanisms that lead that adversity to have such negative effects can be reversed. In fact, some studies that just came out by Sarah Lazar and Marty Teicher
Mhm.
show just that even the effects on the brain can be reversed with mindfulness practices,
Right.
the kind of kindness things you're doing. And so we want to give that scientifically based positive message that being aware of the negative stuff that happened allows you to make sense of it. And that can transform its negative impact on your body, on your brain in the body, and the way you carry yourself in relationships, so that you can actually move past that adversity, make sense of it, and bring kindness into your life. And so that's why you may not be able to change the past, but you can change the way you have responded to the past, how you make sense of it now, and liberate yourself to have a kind and benevolent life.
Beautiful. So well said. Kindness includes everyone, right?
Yes.
And it's who we are in our essence.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Natalie. I feel so privileged to be able to be here with you for this beautiful conversation. And I hope everyone listening will be,
Me too.
absorbing the exciting news.
Me too. Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Take care.
Great to be with you.
Everything. It was wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Kindness in Action with Dr. Natalie Gruber. My hope is that today's conversation left you feeling a little lighter, a little brighter. For me, it's a reminder and an affirmation that kindness is at the heart of healing. And from that kindness, we grow hope and the possibility of a more beautiful future for ourselves and for each other. If something here spoke to you, I'd love for you to share it with someone you care about. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, may you find a little more kindness within and all around you.